Welcome to today's podcast. We're really excited to introduce our guest for today, and we're going to talk about a lot of challenges and misconceptions around AI startups and AI startup capabilities, especially when it comes to large enterprises who may want to bring in an AI startup to help them with some of their challenges. We're going to talk about digitizing and managing the frontline workforce with AI, and some lessons that have been learned from the gig economy. When you start thinking about all of the resources that need to be managed, in a large city, when you talk about Uber or Lyft or other types of or DoorDash or other types of organizations where you have so much going on in the workforce. We'll talk about ways that gets applied to non-gig economy types of organizations. We'll talk about user experience and how user experience is something that really makes a huge difference in terms of the ability to get AI successfully deployed in an organization, and how critical that is to have that simpler user experience in order to take advantage of the capabilities that we're offering. So our guest today has successfully implemented and led digital transformations at companies like McKinsey, eBay, and Uber. He's very passionate about leveraging technology in developing countries and empowering workers in the gig economy. Currently, he's spearheading a company that is focused on digitizing the frontline workforce to maximize productivity and efficiency. Jason Radisson, welcome to the show.
Seth, thanks for having me on. Thanks for the intro.
So one of the things we'd like to kind of begin with is understanding some of the misconceptions in the space, especially the way you're working in organizations and you're looking at how to develop and deploy AI. And a lot of large organizations, number one, they sometimes underestimate the agility that an AI startup can bring to the table. And the other piece of this is there's a lot of challenges around using startups, because many times they don't necessarily have a deep track record, and some of them can come and go. So why don't you talk a little bit about how organizations think about what are some of the misconceptions about how they look at AI startups and how they think about those challenges and how they can bring value to the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are a couple of big ones. I think if you start from the top, one of the most important things, obviously, I'll make the obvious point first, which is got to be quality. It's got to be a quality team. Got to be a team that, has worked with enterprises before. Doesn't need to be for 20 or 30 years, can be for 2 or 3 years. But rarely are you going to find a startup that is a couple of guys in a garage that have never seen the inside of a Fortune 500 company that are just going to come in and rock your socks. I think if you get beyond that and you're working with a good team, I think a lot of the corporate misconceptions, people just don't realize how quickly we work. They don't realize that in a small team with experienced engineers who have worked at all kinds of scales and all kinds of different problems, we can literally have a feature in a week or two. A completely new feature, if it's something as simple as an extra filter, a tweak, an adjustment, a quick integration. People talk about, oh my God, APIs, and how are we going to integrate this stuff? From a quick moving startup that's an experienced team, we can get stuff done literally in a week or two. An integration might actually literally be some senior engineer's time, like 2 hours, if that thing is well specced out. And most of that'll be QAing the 15 minutes of code that he had to write or they had to write to get that done. So I think there's a big misconception there. And probably the third misconception is a lot of companies just don't know how to buy services from a startup. They don't know how to interface with them. It's not sometimes RFPs, the startup needs the feedback and sort of needs the close working relationship to be able to do things on the fly in real time and get them out and operating so that we can adjust to what that big company needs. It's not an RFP thing. We're not sitting on top of 20-year-old code and we're going to negotiate around some terms and
Mhm.
spend 3 months doing that. All of that is a huge waste of time and value for the big enterprise.
Mhm.
So those would be three just kind of right off the top. But there's a lot that we see out there where we just go, oh my God, this is so difficult. And then, there are Fortune 500, there are Fortune 100 companies that know exactly how to buy from startups. 2 weeks after you're talking with them, you're already rolling features out in some, generally well protected, sort of low risk area of the business, but you're already out there operating together.
Mhm.
But that's sort of a top 5 or 10% of enterprise companies, and the rest really, really struggle working with a startup.
You know what? I'm a super fan of agility. I've had a couple startups myself. The thing that's interesting, and you've seen this probably, and I'd love to get your take, is when you walk into an enterprise organization, and they say things like, well, we don't know if we can take on that much change that quickly,
Mhm.
right? Which is actually, I get it, it's a real fear, but how do you kind of get around that or help them ease that,
Yeah.
right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think what is so just just sort of paradigm shifting, such a different world that we're in now, is really true automation um, doesn't require much change management because it's usually obviating work,
Mhm.
which is very different from sort of the ERP era where, we're mapping the company's processes and we're adjusting them, we're optimizing them maybe 10 or 20%. And, all of that has to flow in this big, long, year-long change management. All that stuff is pretty obsolete when you're talking true, like machine learning, heavily automated systems. It's literally plug in the system and then turn off the team that used to do that work.
Mhm.
And it's just, I think enterprise, non sort of tech companies just don't, they're not used to that kind of change management. I think it's very different, I would say, like the Silicon Valley experience, the big tech experience um, is like things work that way. It's the opposite. You have this cultural pressure, and I'll sort of paraphrase what happens a lot in Silicon Valley, but basically your manager comes to you and says, "Hey, Chris, you've been doing that thing 3 times now. Why haven't you automated it? Why isn't engineering here like automating like?" What are you guys doing with 30 guys working on something manually? That makes no sense. So there's this bias in big tech to completely automate anything that is a stable process. Corporate America, typical large enterprise company doesn't have that bias, doesn't have those muscles. And then you get to this, machine learning is now, I think, eh, getting more sort of at least sort of attention, and we have this potential to do even more automation in white collar work than we would have if we didn't have Gen AI, just given the interest levels. And you look at all that and you go, well, there's a whole generation of corporate leaders in corporate America that don't know how to automate away their processes. And and start with yeah, that's a year-long change management. No, it's not. It's actually stand up the automated process and then turn off the manual process. So very
Yeah.
different world that we're in now.
I think we get into this thinking too of, you know, um, like for instance, going to, like you said, a non-tech enterprise, and their best thinkers are still within the weeds of their own cultural barriers and dynamics and everything else and legacy thinking. And so they're the ones that are quote unquote supposed to be the tip of the spear. And yet, to your point, they come in and say, no, 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 that's going to take, like you said, a year to actually really get implemented. And we have to do like, if we want machine learning, we have to collect all of our data at the same time and figure out how to get it into one spot, which is not the case. This is,
Totally, totally.
better need
It's one
as
of the
enough. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's one of the biggest fallacies in IT is that everything starts with an enterprise data warehouse and a data lake. And it's just it's nonsensical. It's very expensive. It's very self-serving for database vendors. They've trained a whole generation of IT leaders to think that.
Mhm.
But it's ridiculous. You have to work backwards from the use cases that ring the cash register.
Mhm.
And those may require you to instrument your mobile app with 2 or 3 new variables, and that might be 80% of the value from your database. You need to sort of, I think, always have that customer first,
Mhm.
sort of use case first mentality before you do any investments. And
Mm.
we just see it. We see it time and time again. I mean, there are entire, very large cap database vendors out there that have built their whole sort of legacy on that approach.
Mm.
Very, very different world. I guess, I could see there was a time where some of that stuff was relevant because,
Mhm.
it just databases were so, they were so expensive. And so
Mhm.
it was a big CapEx project if you were going to think about how you were going to collect any data.
Mm.
If I think back to the wireless industry 25, 30 years ago,
Mm.
it was an enterprise project to get a little database together. But
Mm.
I mean, these days that's the laptop,
Mm.
not $100 million item. And it's just crazy to see what companies go through and how twisted up they get, and often hiring in, our new digital leader, and that person comes in and spends 3 years building a data warehouse before they even really have any use cases that are working.
Right.
I mean, to be fair, like I mean, waterfall had its time too, where it actually was relevant, but
Right.
also is synonymous with a huge capex type of a approach, as opposed to fail fast with cloud-based services or whatever that is, right? That are super.
Right.
Anyway,
Right. Yeah, and I think it's fundamental to the startup approach. And I think
Mhm.
the reason big tech is so different from non-tech enterprise is just, they were all startups at one point. They
Mm.
all know, there's no there's no way Facebook is going to forget how to do some iterative stuff to see how a product works.
Mm.
Given the DNA that they're built on.
So, quick question. When you start uh, going through these enterprises and you start, you've been working in both startups and large corporations, what challenges are there right now in educating executives? Because they've moved through part of the learning curve, but I think there's still this kind of, well, AI is important. They're still not completely clear on what to do with it. They're definitely not clear on what they need to do to make it work successfully. Where do you see the challenges in breaking through the noise and educating executives?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I kind of break those challenges down into two buckets. I think there's a group of companies that has a burning platform.
Hmm.
And so AI, whether it's Gen AI or whether it's some machine learning and more specific systems, technology is a way to sort of fix that big problem or that big opportunity, get to that big opportunity that they all know about. And
Hmm.
then I think you've got a whole class of companies where, they might even have existential risk around the corner. They're not really looking at it. They might not have done the far out planning to kind of put those pieces together to see, shoot, in 2 years, actually, we're going to get a whole class of competitors because of this technology. They may have a lot of internal, they might have 5 or 6 items that are sort of occupying everybody's headspace. And so they can't really get consensus momentum around which one to action on first. So I think you just I don't know, it's difficult. I think you kind of have to think about what are your actionable pivot points in all of this. And, as a corporate leader, where is, you know, where do I recognize, how do I recognize that I've got a big opportunity and then how do I execute on it? And I think those are the two, right? The one is sort of the strategic
Yeah,
reckoning. The other is like actual muscle
right.
to go spin something up. And, I think there's a good best practice out there, which is like, it's basically the 6-week execution practice, which is like, if you have a pivot point, try to do something about it in 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
If it just sort of, it's enough time to get some rough product together. with 5 or 10 folks in a small engineering team.
Mhm.
It's not a big corporate investment. If you have to get some outside help from an engineering shop to go do that, whatever the case, but making sure that you're doing things and you're not just talking about it and going to meetings for a year and
Right.
a half, vaguely keeping this stuff in mind, but rather actually doing something.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, what's going to ring the cash register, right? What's going to improve
Yeah.
efficiencies? What's going to have an impact? And that's through understanding those processes and those use cases, saying, here's our objective, and then,
Yeah.
what's going to enable that objective, and then how do we measure it? What are our baselines, right? And how do we
Yeah,
implement
very much so.
intervention that's going to enable that?
The key though was definitely from the cash back, because that's the value prop. But I think the critical notion of that too for all of us that are in this spot is working backwards from that goal, and just in terms of that perspective, because otherwise it'll just go on and conflate forever and ever and ever, instead of, hey, listen, here's exactly what we're driving at, and we've got to be able to do that. The beauty of that too is we've done it in a week, or we could do it in 6 weeks, right? Whatever the true goal is, to see that one quick thing that's going to help with the additional investment.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that gets you to these hard questions, the make versus buy question, the technologically possible, right? You might come into some hardware or software constraint, like, look, like the hardware that's available today doesn't actually support that use case. Let's keep our eye on the companies that are developing new stuff in that hardware dimension, whatever the case might be, but it actually gets you on top of the pivot point, rather than just like I said, kind of vaguely, knowing the risk is there, but not being able to execute on it.
Yeah. And I want to ask you about how you've taken it. We didn't mention exactly what you're doing today, so I want you to kind of go back and talk about what you have done with other organizations in terms of managing the workforce and managing the gig economy types of workforces, and then how has that kind of brought you into this space that you're working in today, and what are the lessons learned? So you worked for Uber for a while. Do you want to talk a little bit about that work?
Yeah, so there's a lot. I ran a region in the US in the early days of Uber, and there's a lot to that that's not specifically technology related. There's a lot of government relations and otherwise there. But what I would say, specific and germane to like what I'm doing today and, the kinds of problems the team and I are working on. So, what I realized from the gig economy was, if you take the software as it is, right, and essentially a marketplace for getting work done, a two-sided marketplace in the case of Uber, in the case of some of the delivery apps that I've worked with, invested in, a three-sided marketplace. There's a ton of efficiency there. And so broadly speaking, what I was thinking about in founding Movo was, how can we bring the kind of efficiency that we see in the gig economy to corporate America, to large foreign multinational companies that might be out there with tens of thousands of workers with a ton of inefficiency. And very broadly speaking, how do we improve the lot of the frontline worker, whoever they might be, whatever inefficiency and difficulty they have in getting ahead? So I think if you look at it as a win-win situation, and I think of platforms and marketplaces as you got to make them win-win if they're going to be sustainable and if they're going to be profitable and not just a big leaky bucket that eventually people forget about a couple years later. You look at the problem set that's out there, and a couple of areas of technology become really evident. And I'll preface this all by saying it's all machine learning. I mean, you look at the core of the different features and functionalities and systems, they're all machine learning systems. So basically, you've got a massive scheduling capability. So one of the things these marketplaces do is they slot workers to demand for work extremely efficiently. The other thing that they do is they distribute tasks, and they give you sort of a very transparent task completion, task issuance, and task completion set of technologies. And I looked at those and I thought, you look at the logistics industry in the US, you look at clinical staff in the US healthcare system, you look at housekeeping in the US hospitality market. You look at a lot of these big job classes that employ, by the way, millions and millions of Americans. And they're not digitized, and they're certainly not digitized in any kind of real-time streaming optimized way. So that was sort of the thinking that got us to Movo. And the team and I started in 2019 with some experiments. 2020, we got very active in the beginning of the pandemic. We all had just gone full time in January of 2020. And then in March of 2020, as the pandemic really hit and the shutdowns started happening, we actually closed a deal with Amazon and started helping them with some of their most burning labor issues. And in particular in Minneapolis, in everything that came with social unrest and everything that was going on in those early days of the pandemic. So a lot of learnings along the way. Along the way, we've hired 700,000 people in the US and deployed them. As we look at the latest iterations of our product, we're really extremely focused on the scheduling problem because I still believe that's one of the biggest drags on the economy. Right. But that's Movo in a nutshell, and the kind of services that we're out there providing.
And it's movo.co, C-O.
That's right, movo.co.
Yeah.
Anyway,
you are founders. And you're founder and CEO, which I didn't say.
That's right.
Sorry about that. But it's interesting when you think about what's going on with the gig economy, and you have thousands and tens of thousands of workers that are out there in real time challenges, and you kind of maybe analogy to battlefield conditions, right? Because everything is changing. You're deploying assets, you're redeploying assets, you're having problems, things are happening, and then you still have edge cases that humans need to deal with, but you're taking the brunt of all of that brute force work of aligning, supply with demand and lining up tasks with workers and making sure that those are completely fulfilled and all of the follow-up and all of that stuff that happens with it. And I can see how that could obviously be applied to large workforces and at multiple levels, right? Going beyond scheduling, trying to corral and understand what all of these remote workers are doing, right? And how their work is being accomplished and how they're using automated tools. And it's kind of like this expanding universe of capabilities that you could be looking at and thinking about in terms of how do you optimize, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of workers in terms of what they're doing and how they're contributing to the organization. So it's a fascinating space. And one of the things that we had talked about is the fact that there's an organization, there are other organizations that do this stuff, right? Like especially with the scheduling apps. However, one of the things, and at the core, you could say function by function, feature by feature, maybe they're equivalent or whatever it is. But the big difference is that user experience, right? So when you start thinking about how do people use these things and because we've all been in terrible applications, right? And what is it about a terrible application that makes it terrible? It doesn't align with your mental model, right? It doesn't align with your thinking about how to solve that problem and how to go about your task. So why don't you talk a little bit about your view of user experience when it comes to the machine learning and AI space?
Very much. So broadly speaking, a lot of people are working on what I would broadly call the problem of who should work where. And, you can look at whether it's an ATS or a hiring platform, some of the job boards like the Indeeds of the world, people are working on who fits this particular job, matching that supply and demand. What we've done at Movo is we've taken it about 10 steps further to where should this particular person with this particular skill set be working in this instant, based on everything we know about them, based on what we know about their scheduling preferences, based on what we know about their employer's demand for labor in this moment. So we integrate in real time with the labor forecast, and some clients, we help them build their labor forecast. And that gives us a user experience because of that real-time machine learning optimal allocation of each person's minute of work. We're in this position to give a very, very modern worker experience. So the worker, the employee, any given time has a ton of opportunity, at least the opportunity that exists in the company to go pick up an extra shift, to pick up an extra credential, to be able to work a different shift, or to be able to level up. All of those opportunities are completely transparent to the worker. And they're mostly, if they're interacting, they're just interacting with a mobile app. They're not having to go, the old school way of, having lunch with supervisors to try to figure out who might have an opportunity. Supervisors don't have to go the old school way of calling and trying to find, if you don't have the text, the mobile numbers of the different workers that are out there. All of this is just handled by bots. The bots make sure that everybody's in the right spot, and the bots surface all of the opportunities that are out there in the company. So it's a long slog to sort of get all the machine learning in place to be able to do that. But once you have that kind of capability, it's such a modern, light, easy experience for the employee that nobody wants to go back. And so, I look at it as like, in some ways, solving scheduling is one of the best things you can do for worker engagement, for giving them the feeling of empowerment. They're more empowered over their own time and flexibility. They're more empowered over their career path than almost anything else you could do.
I'd love to get you to build workforce management systems for call centers. And I've always loved the gig economy perspective, right? Of this, like, hey, I want to self-choose. What have you seen, though, is the inverse impact of that on the psychology of almost borderline entitlement / empowerment? Does that make sense? When we're thinking about those, especially with an organization that's coming from years, like decades or centuries of culture that is very much steeped in,
right,
if work for 40 years or whatever. I'd love to get a take for what you've seen in psychology change in that.
Oh, totally. And, and I'm not sure how many HR leaders might be in your audience as well. I think it's very relevant for them also. I think there are guardrails. Most people focus on the guardrails. The guardrail on the one hand is the employer guardrail, and it says, this is the schedule, take it or leave it. I think the other guardrail is sort of the, completely gigified, hey, this is when I'm going to work this week, take it or leave it, employee perspective. The way we solve it with most clients is we will fill the schedule based on your preferences. However, if we don't have anybody that wants to work a shift, we're going to put somebody in it. And so, it's somewhere in the middle. We're meeting employees somewhere in the middle. And like I said, I think success long-term of any workforce, really, any marketplace, but any workforce, is it's got to be win-win. And you have to kind of find these kinds of solutions. And I think we've got it. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have employers that see it a little bit more on their side. And, we're still figuring it out on a case-by-case basis. But it's basically that. It starts with the employee experience, starts with the employee putting their preferences in, that then mostly get honored. The other thing, too, we automatically do a bunch of substitutions. We do substitutions, we do peer-to-peer shift swapping. So even if you don't really get your preferences in your main shift is 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, but you would really like to have Thursdays off, but the company says, too bad, sorry, we can't honor that because we need you on Thursday, right? You can still put in to be an alternate on a bunch of other shifts. Say you want to pick up some weekend hours, and you get those. So even if we can't always honor 100% your preferences, we might be able to open up some new space and some new earning potential that you wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. So, it's not just black and white, like, no on Thursday, but more case by case. And I think that's just life. And I think the best supervisors have kind of always done that. We just, in creating the system in the way we have, we've been able to replicate that in this automated way.
It was
We'll
always
try on Thursdays. We won't say no. We'll try.
Right. All right. And maybe one Thursday's slow. So, maybe you get a Thursday a month off. You don't get all of them off. So to us, that feels modern. And I think we've been talking. I mean, it's a compromise. I think we're all sort of dealing with generational shift, right?
No.
We go to X to Z to X, Y, and Z, and people have different expectations. And look, it is not going to be 100% the employee guardrail. Nobody can run a business that way either. And
Right. Of course.
it just is what it is, I think, at this point.
We found too, some of the, we'll say, older generations were able to leapfrog into a gig economy thinking because they had been out of the workforce for so long that they kind of skipped that generation of, they used to be super, like cultural 9 to 5, and then they're out of the workforce for a while, and now they jump back in, and now it's this perspective of complete flexibility in theory. But it's been really interesting. So that was the hardest binary problem to solve in a lot of cases was, here's the plan. However, when the plan hits reality, and you have people that are out sick, and then Corona, provided a whole new, perspective.
Right.
Just the binary goes out the door quick around like, it has to be flexibility in there. That's
very much
really.
I think there's some really interesting, and as you guys know, I've worked in China and in particular with Didi, who bought my last company. I've also worked a lot in Latin America, and I think there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out of the developing world. Large companies in Latin America see the gig economy as the competition for labor. They go, if you're running a bottling plant, you're a massive bottling plant, you're competing with Rappi and Uber for employees. And, all the employees that are coming in, all your front line is used to having everything be based in a mobile app and having that complete flexibility. So, I like to think that with the solutions that we're finding with each employer and sort of where that slider is, that we're actually providing an even better experience. Because, the flip side of the gig economy is you have perfect flexibility to pick whatever hours you want, but you may pick really crappy hours. You may pick an hour where or a schedule where there's no riders or there's no orders to be delivered. And so you make no money. Versus, if a hospital's having you come in, it's because they have work for you. It's not like you're not going to get paid in our world.
So
that's awesome.
I have a question about organizations taking risks and looking at where they are in terms of their AI journey. And one of the things we talked about in our prep call was that, you'll talk to some executives and they'll say, well, we're getting our infrastructure together and our tech stack, and we're doing these things, and we're not ready to do that. And I hear that a lot. We're not ready. We're still trying to figure out, what the bet is. And so you had mentioned the fact that there can be $1 million bets and there can be $1 billion bets. And I think you meant it in terms of the implication for organization. And even if we bring it down an order of magnitude or two and say, $100,000 bets versus million or 10 million, you need a couple of different things in order to do that. Number one, you need an executive that it believes in it and that has enough social capital to be able to affect change. Obviously, you need budget for that. You need the right set of use cases, but you really do need that kind of expansive thinking about where the organization can be and what it can do. And do you want to talk a little bit about that mindset and what you've experienced? And I think it was really interesting the way you said, multi-million versus multi-billion, or even again, if you say 100,000 versus million, but talk a little bit about that mindset and how organizations need to cultivate that, and how executives need to go into these things thinking about the potential impact.
Totally. Well, to try to put it a little bit in my answer, a little bit as a pivot point, I think the pivot point is if you're in a company and there is a lack of a common understanding of what the big automation opportunities are. So my challenge to anybody in a large corporate environment would be, can you name off the top of your head 4 or 5 big automation opportunities
Mhm.
and put dollar opportunity, like dollars behind them, like we were saying, this is a $2 billion opportunity. This is a $20 million opportunity. This is a $200,000 opportunity. Because I think that's the place, the mindset, the headspace you have to be in. And then everything just becomes execution. And, in terms of change management, yes, you're going to have to, figure out the path that your company and culture and everything demand to sort of get there. But at least you're clear on the what. I think it usually starts with a lack of even understanding the what.
Yeah.
One of the biggest examples that takeaways and examples from my career. So I worked for Gary Loveman at Harrah's Entertainment and then Caesars Entertainment. I was the post-merger guy. I ran database marketing there and the statistics and algorithms team and post-merger management. And we when we bought Caesars, part of the justification, we were both publicly traded companies. We had literally twice the EBITDA per square foot in our company that they did. And the reason we had it was largely due to an algorithmic approach to base management. Like we would get a new customer, someone would come into our casino for 5 seconds and we would figure out what they were worth. And then we would start disproportionately spending on them, on the customers who were worth it, who had the upside. And we did that just famously. There's a bunch of HBS case studies out there and, our business review articles and other business press and academic work that's been done around that. But the crazy thing was it was all published. Literally our algorithms were published.
Wow.
For years and years, and literally Caesars Entertainment right across the strip from us didn't employ any of the strategies.
That's mind-boggling. Go ahead.
And that's that stuck with me my entire career, where I say one of the biggest problems in corporate America is a lack of sort of understanding where the big levers are. And it's not an individual thing. It's not like there's nobody at Caesars that ever understood that, but it was sort of an enterprise level thing that the company couldn't sort of click the right pieces into place in order to execute on the playbooks that were winning in the industry.
So this is where I famously say, at least famously to myself, that having the answer doesn't matter, right? Like I say,
right.
Having the answer doesn't matter. Like I can publish articles and say, this is the way it is, and here's how you do it, and here's the case study. And yet there's this, there's this weird like gap. And right. I'm so glad to hear you tell me this, right? Because it makes me feel like it's not just me that you had published these things. They showed the value. HBR picked it up. All of these, I would want to go back and interview those executives and say, what were you thinking, or what were you not thinking? Like, why did you not know about this? Like, had you heard about this? I'm sure they have.
Right.
Has anybody done any kind of forensic discovery or research to see?
It's
do it.
Yeah. It's so totally. It's so long ago, but I can talk a little bit about, sort of the experience in the post-merger, clean room, but then, or non-clean room, but then sort of the post-merger stuff. But what I would say, take the example.
When you say clean room in that context, you're meaning regarding data, or how are you using
clean room? What I mean is in the pre-merger phase where the two companies planned together, right?
Yeah.
And so, we got a good look into things, and I'm not, like this is like the companies have changed owners numerous times, and there have been other books written about sort of
this is all public information,
everything that's happened. But let's take the example, an algorithmic example. Let's take yield management. So the pricing of rooms. So there's, for those that are out in the hospitality world, there's an old school way of doing it, which is there's literally a guy or a gal who prices rooms, right? And it's the mom and pop way, and it's like, here's our calendar and here's what our rooms cost. And that was replaced kind of famously, kind of with some technology that came out of commodities trading back in the 80s, and with American Airlines, and with like the real-time pricing of airline seats. And then the casino industry deployed that through, there was this company called Pros that was running around sort of selling real-time room pricing. And at Harrah's Entertainment, we had 9 segments, and we priced our rooms in real time. And we had kind of done this, and this was sort of a top-down decision, sort of since I think Gary Loveman sort of came to the company. If you look at Caesars Entertainment, they had manual, sort of old school room pricing pretty much everywhere in the company, and they were working on an extremely complex 99 segment room pricing system that hadn't really been deployed. And 99 cents, problem with 99 segments is you don't have enough traffic, like you just get into kind of very messy answers with very low statistical significance. So we'd long sort of rejected sort of a extremely fine grain model. 9 segments was enough for us. But I mean, and we can talk about, other things that they kind of got wrong, but like fundamentally, like they sort of made, and like I said, this is all these people, all the roles have changed, everything's changed. This is 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago. But I think the important learning is like they made essentially sort of a extremely half-hearted effort to even sort of pay lip service to what needed to have happen. And that I think is where a lot of this stuff gets bogged down. It's like, even if there's pressure to have the strategy in place, and what should they have done? They should have taken our model and exactly replicated it in one casino and proven the difference, proven that they could get the 2x lift in revenues per room and EBITDA per room, and then, had the momentum to be able to have done more change. It might have been a very different sort of history of the industry if they had done even that simple thing. So it's a long story, but the moral is really short, which is I think you've got to know the what, but to your point, Seth, knowing the what isn't enough.
Audio there, Jason, can you hear Jason?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
can hear him fine.
This audio.
Yep.
Okay.
Huh.
Yeah, no, it sounded
Looks like I've lost audio.
I think
I have lost your audio.
Say,
Here we go. You're back. Okay. I don't know what happened there. Yeah. Carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, as they say, from the old, from what you were saying before, you miss 100% of the things you're not looking for, and I think that's what happens is you get, these organizations get in the weeds and can't figure out, what the hell to do because they don't know what to look for it, right? And to your point, they don't have anybody that's there to say, hey, by the way, did you see what they're doing across the street? And is that interesting? Should we think about that? And usually that's lower, below the budget line type of folks that are seeing that kind of stuff. But above the budget line, people think they've got it made in the shade, so they're doing it, and they just mess in a huge way.
Yeah.
So.
We're getting to the end here. So, Jason, tell me a little bit more about your world. Do you have kids? Do you have hobbies? Do you have pets? Do you travel? What else do you do besides work?
Yeah, family and outdoors are really the things that I do outside of work. I have 4 kids. From 18 to 3. So we're busy on that front. And we moved to Minnesota during the pandemic, and I've kind of grown up in the outdoors and do everything from skiing to fishing and hunting, and I'm just out in the woods with the kids as much as I possibly can be outside of work.
So after the 3-year-old, what's the next age? What's the next old?
3, 4. Yeah. People often think they're twins. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We re-upped. Yeah.
This has been great. I've really enjoyed chatting. And what do you see as the next frontier? When you talk about workforce management, like I could see this being the beginning of a lot of stuff, like in terms of optimizing a workforce. What do you see on the horizon? What's the future look like?
Well, I mean, I think it's funny to watch the evolution of Gen AI, and I think, you can't help but look at Gen AI and realize that it's a general technology that sort of needs to come back around to solving real specific use cases. And I think that evolution is going to happen. We saw it with machine learning. I think machine learning was a little bit stealthier, a little more under the radar and just kind of done. There was just a day when we all woke up and Amazon was there with a real-time optimized homepage, and we kind of didn't realize it. We didn't, there was just a day we woke up and American Airline was charging us a specific price for a seat. There are so many fully automated, very smart systems in the world. And I think what's going to happen with Gen AI is it's just going to come back around and it'll enhance some of those engines. It'll, sort of support a ton of new use cases. But I think that process is just in its infancy.
Mm.
I look at, what that means for work. It probably means some of the same things that we've seen in machine learning companies, which is we need a lot more of these sort of operations research, industrial engineering job classes. I've been bullish on that, university program, college program for 20 something years. I used to, speaking of Caesars Harrah's, lead campus recruiting for undergrad and for business school and grad school. And those types of roles are as hot today as they ever were back then. I think those are the people that are going to be leading these systems. And that's where a lot of the job growth is going to be. And I'm very bullish on the frontline workforce. And I don't think we're going to be replacing nurses, home healthcare people, a lot of hospitality service people. Any of that is going anywhere anytime soon. So you look at all of these advancements, probably the role of supervising and, we're going to see more sort of remote plus forward deployed resources, I think is just this new evolving model of work. And, this is the new reality. We are, half the time going to be talking to people and running teams on Zoom and, and other tools like Movo. And, there's going to be a little sliver of the old world, but I think we're already pretty much into this new mode, and I'm just excited for everything that it needs.
It's going to change quickly, and it's mov.co.co, and you can connect with Jason Radisson, Radisson. That will be in the show notes. I really want to thank you for joining us today, Jason. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you guys, Seth, Chris, both for having me on the show. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
Pleasure.
Great.
Absolutely.
Thank you to the audience for listening and tuning in. This has been another episode of the Earley AI Podcast. And thank you for Carolyn for her behind the scenes work, and Chris. And again, thank you, Jason. We'll look forward to continuing our conversations and collaborations. So really enjoyed it today. Thank you.
Visit Earley.com to find links to the full podcast on all audio platforms to listen on the go. Thank you for watching. Contact us today at info@earley.com.